So the aluminium age, there may well be a range of diseases that are important with respect to the aluminium age, and here is just potentially a few of them, with perhaps the one that most people have heard about, perhaps the most controversial, Alzheimer's disease at the center. 95, 96, 97, we're not quite sure, percent of all forms of Alzheimer's disease that we get have virtually no genetic component. As was said in the introduction, I started my work in 1984 on aluminium, and it's only 30 years later, in 2014, that I would be prepared to write a paper, an invited paper, with as provocative a title as this. So very briefly today, I want to go through with you why I have come to the conclusion that under certain circumstances, it is inevitable that human exposure to aluminium contributes to Alzheimer's disease. Inevitable. Not possible anymore, but inevitable. We have had, over the last 10 years in particular, the great privilege to work on a number of human brains. It's always a major privilege to work on human tissue, and human brain tissue, of course, in particular. It's very difficult to get the necessary ethical approval to do this, and it's also the type of work, when you know you're actually dealing with some brain tissue from a donor, you need to make sure you do the very best possible science with that. You use it to its very best effect. We had a fantastic opportunity a few years ago to look at 60 human brains and to look at metal content. In this case, we're talking about aluminium. The aluminium content of 60 human brains taken from a brain bank where approximately 60% of those individuals had a neurological condition, most of those Alzheimer's, and the other 40 did not. They would be controlled. They would perhaps have other conditions, but would not been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. What examples have I come across recently, apart from that 60 human brain study, which have begun to change my mind, or at least make me absolutely certain about aluminium's role in the disease? Various types of case studies. In this was a famous case where individuals were exposed to aluminium through aluminium in their tap water. It's a case in England, in Camelford. Again, don't get me talking about it, otherwise you'll miss the rest of the meeting. But what we found in this, a lady in her 50s who was exposed to this event in the late 80s, her husband called me after she died and was diagnosed with an unknown neurological condition. Can you find someone to improve on that for me, Chris? So I asked one of the world's leading neuropathologists, Margaret Asiri at Oxford University, to look at this woman's brain. She did that. She found this diagnosis of a form of Alzheimer's disease called conjophilic amyloid angiopathy, CAA. The only thing we need to take from this is that the form of CAA she had never been seen before in someone as young as she was. In fact, it had rarely been seen before, and only in people in their 80s or 90s. When we measured the aluminium content of her brain tissue, we found numbers that you can see on the board behind me, which are considerably higher than 1 or 2. In other words, her brain was packed with aluminium, and she had a really rare and unusual form of Alzheimer's. Almost certainly, her exposure to aluminium contributed to this case. Another example which set me on my road to my current beliefs is through an occupational exposure of an individual whose job changed dramatically, such that he was asked, after working in the same company for many years, to be cleaning out a kiln where they were firing products made from aluminium. He wasn't provided with any sort of respiratory equipment. And within 4 or 5 years of working, he started to have memory problems. And in his early 50s, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. By the time he got to mid-60s, he had died. And again, through a coroner, court got in touch with me and asked me to do the analysis on brain tissue. This gave us a great opportunity because we also got a very large quantity of brain tissue this time. And we were able to show in a large quantity of brain tissue a very high average amount, as we can see here. So my conclusion again here was it's absolutely, without any question, that in this individual, getting Alzheimer's 10, 15, 20 years earlier than you might expect, although we should not expect to get Alzheimer's, that this individual had very high levels of aluminium. The aluminium must have contributed to his disease. Actually, this is just the recent paper just showing that place in Camelford, Cornwall, we're now getting more and more brains. People are dying because they were exposed in the late 80s. They're dying now. We're getting opportunities to look at more and more brain tissue. And here is another example where someone got Alzheimer's relatively early onset in their 60s with high levels of aluminium in their brain tissue. Okay, so this is where we get to, I think, game-changing data. Because up until now, yes, we have measured the aluminium content in human brain tissue in people, control individuals, people with Alzheimer's disease. And we've found a number of interesting things, including good examples of where the aluminium content has become so high that we think it's inevitable that it makes some contribution, because we know aluminium is neurotoxic. So what about the sort of blue star form of Alzheimer's disease? The familial form of Alzheimer's disease, because of the nature of the genetic mutations that are involved, is used as a template for understanding all Alzheimer's disease. We had the incredible privilege recently to get hold of brain tissue from 12 donors who had died with familial Alzheimer's disease. These spanned 25 years, so the brain bank in London, where we got them from, had only had 12 donors in 25 years. So this shows you the rarity of true familial Alzheimer's disease. Well, I don't need to turn around and I don't need to use my little red laser on the numbers there for you to see what those numbers look like compared to 1 microgram per gram dry weight or 2 micrograms. The levels of aluminium in the brains of people who have died with familial Alzheimer's disease are the highest levels we have measured, full stop, in any circumstances, in any brain tissue. So quite quickly we can come to some sort of assumption, at least, that these genetic predispositions also predispose individuals to possibly retaining very high levels of aluminium in the brain. And if that is the case, it's highly likely that the early onset form of the disease, the aggressive nature of these diseases, is brought on and accelerated by the presence of aluminium.